Zachary Gibson. And Zach Gibson is a licensed certified professional counselor and a national certified counselor. He works in community mental health currently. So he works with youth up to age 25 and also works in private practice. And while we're listening to his presentation today, we, like Kirsten said, we have a notes page available on the website, and I just posted that in the chat if you'd like to go and either print that out or download it and have it ready to take some notes or just be referring to it during the presentation. But these questions here on the notes page, or there on the notes page, were provided to us by Zach Gibson, by the presenter, who presented at the WIOA Summit. And so some of the questions that he posed here about keeping youth engaged during the pandemic, how have you personally adapted to life during and post-pandemic? Think about a participant who may have had trouble engaging. And then it talks about identifying possible external barriers, which he talks about. Considering the whole person, we support others. How can you support your participants to care for the whole personhood while trying to succeed for program tasks and goals? So just really important questions for us to be considering while we're watching the recording of the presentation, and it'll really help our discussion to be engaging this afternoon. And speaking of that, if you haven't had a chance to register for our discussion session this afternoon at 1 o'clock, that kind of is in conjunction of this session, watching the presentation, please go ahead and do that. And I just stuck that in the chat. So again, welcome. Hopefully you've had a minute to take a peek at those questions, and I'm going to hand it back to Kirsten, and she's going to introduce and get the presentation started.
Great, thank you, Tara. Okay, so we will start the recording. We've skipped ahead a little bit just to take out the beginning housekeeping things, and then we will get started. I apologize, I forgot to do our polls. So really quickly, we will do our WIOA Wednesday webinar polls that we do every Wednesday. If you could feel free to please respond to these, and then we'll get started with the recording. I apologize. So which partner do you best represent, and where are you joining us from this morning? So we'll give everyone a second to vote for these. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple people from Title II and other WIOA partners and stakeholders as well. So thank you for joining us. And then where are you guys joining us from this morning is what we would like to know. So where is your local area? I'm joining you from Central Illinois. Our office is located in Bloomington, and then we're actually still working from home. So I live in Decatur, Illinois. And then Tara is joining us from up north, right?
Yes, ma'am, from the Chicago suburbs.
All right. So I will end that poll. So a couple of you are joining us from Central Illinois, a couple of you from Southern, and one from up near Tara as well. So thank you for joining us this morning. And those are just for our analytics, so we appreciate you taking those. And then we will get started. Here we go.
And real quick, I'm going to post a Google Doc with those questions as well, for people to take notes just in case it's easier to access. There we go.
Great. Thank you, Tara.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Here we go.
A little bit about what to expect today in terms of information and what I'd like you to learn from our time together today. We are going to talk a little bit about mental health specific to the COVID pandemic. I want to provide some updates to you on just numbers that have been coming out recently so that you have a full understanding of what young people and adults are going through in terms of mental health as impacted by the pandemic. We're going to spend some time teaching you about the foundations of anxiety and trauma. So I want you to understand how those work in our brains as people And my hope is that that can help us reframe how we approach the young people that we work with to have a more informed, both trauma-informed and mental health-informed approach as we're supporting young folks to engage more fully in their lives right now. Part of our work together today will be to obviously improve some skill building for you. So we're going to work specifically on validation, some problem solving skills, and then talking a little bit about stress management through self-care. And my fourth objective is not one that we're going to address, but I'm hoping that it will happen for you throughout our time together, is to learn a little bit about some introspection, so ways to pay attention to your own responses, your own emotional needs as you work to support the young people in your work life. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to have Sarah introduce our first poll for you. We are talking today about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on youth mental health, specifically anxiety and how that's impacting us. I want to take a second and have you answer this poll because I think it's important that we humanize our experience. We can acknowledge that we as adults are definitely impacted by the pandemic. And as soon as we get to about 80%, this is me requesting your participation throughout the day. As soon as we get to 80%, we'll just kind of take a look at our results. So far, I'm seeing kind of the answers that I was anticipating. I'll share that with you in just a moment. So we've had 120 of us answer this poll, and I'll have you know that there's not a single response for not impacted. I think that's very important to understand as we conceptualize mental health. I see the greatest number in just impacted, kind of generally impacted in the middle. There's definitely some folks who have been significantly or greatly impacted. And so as we think about our own experience during this pandemic, I want you to be able to transfer that to the young people that we support, right? So we have our own experience, we can name that. We have to understand that those young folks are also impacted in such ways that we might not understand just from seeing them. All right, I'm gonna end our poll. Oh, I don't know how to share results. Can I do that? Hopefully you can see that. So these are kind of your answers. Like I said, the greatest group of us are impacted, definitely greatly and significantly impacted as well. As we think about our own responses today, I'm going to go ahead and guide you in a bit of a mindful meditation. So I want to invite you for just a moment. We're going to do some centering for our time here together today. I want you to do this in a way that feels most comfortable to you. You're welcome to focus on the image on your screen if that feels best to you. You're also welcome to close your eyes if that feels possible or comfortable. You can also pick a static spot. That could be a spot on your desk or on the wall. And I'm just going to guide you through this for a couple of minutes to center our time together today. Begin by bringing your attention into your body. Close your eyes if that feels comfortable or possible for you. You can notice your body seated wherever you're seated. Feeling the weight of your body on your chair, on the floor. Take a few deep breaths. And as you take a deep breath, bring in more oxygen, enlivening your body. As you exhale, have a sense of relaxing more deeply. You can notice your feet on the floor. Notice the sensations of your feet touching the floor, the weight and pressure, vibration, heat. You can notice your legs against the chair, pressure, pulse, heaviness, lightness. Notice your back against the chair. Bring your attention into your stomach area. If your stomach is tense or tight, let it soften. Take a breath. Notice your hands. Are your hands tense or tight? See if you can allow them to soften. Notice your arms. Feel any sensations in your arms. Let your shoulders be soft and loose. Notice your neck and throat. Let them be soft, relax. Soften your jaw. Let your face and facial muscles be soft. Then notice your whole body presently. Take one more breath. Be aware of your whole body as best you can. And as you take one more breath, when you're ready, I invite you to bring your attention back to us here as we continue. The purpose of a guided meditation like that is really to allow us to focus on the sensations and feelings that we have. It can be a vulnerable act for some people, but I'm going to ask you to do that a couple of times throughout the day because we need to be in tune with ourselves as we support young people moving forward. Okay? So we are here today to definitely talk about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. First, I want to talk a little bit about some of what you've already shared in terms of how you've been impacted. I see a little bit of chatter in the chat box here just about ways that folks have experienced that, whether it's personally or through society. I want to think specifically about the young people that I've been working with that might look very similarly to the folks you've been working with too. And so we're going to just really explore what that kind of looks like for them. So when we think about the pandemic, as it's been so far, I think we're going on about 14 months, and correct me if that sounds wrong. But we have experienced, and the young people have experienced, a complete disturbance of their routine and familiarity. What I mean by that is everything that we've known before has changed. I realize that you all are adult people, you're in the working world, and you understand that, but I name it for you today because sometimes I think we forget that as we work with young people. It is our job to model for them that we can name what's going on in the world. And so it's important to recognize we may need to name for them that they've lost their routine and their familiarity. What that looks like is folks who are working, their work environment has shifted. Maybe they're required to do a different schedule. They're required to work in different ways with fewer people, with different, kind of customer-facing positions, feeling very different. When it comes to education, the young people that I work with, we've gone through different stages. I'm sure you're familiar with, is it remote learning? Is it hybrid learning? Is it all in person? It depends on where you live. And so those changes just happening over time have had a great impact on the consistency of routine for young people. The other thing that they've struggled with is really being able to understand the use of kind of social mitigation tactics, right? So we're asking young people to wear a mask for 6 hours a day when they're at school. We're asking them to, basically behave like adults in terms of their ability to apply a mask and distancing and all of that. We're asking a lot of these young people. And so that is a huge disturbance of how they normally live their lives. One thing that we can all probably acknowledge is the disturbance of our routine and familiarity. The ways that we access our community have changed completely. So that might be, planning things out a bit more than we used to. We don't just run to the store anymore. We have to make sure we have everything with us and that we're getting what we need. And so for young people to not have that flexibility is very important to understand. I think that one of the biggest impacts of COVID for all of us has been that lack of socialization or the feeling of isolation. I'd be curious. I can see some of you, but not all of you. So I'm curious by a raise of hands, has anyone felt isolated, like you haven't seen your colleagues or coworkers in a year? Great. We've been together a little bit, but we've been together mostly virtually and trying to engage in that way. Young people have had virtually no social time. So when it comes to their school routine, they don't have the time before school and don't have the time after school. They have lost that kind of socialization when it comes to middle school, high school, even college is completely different at this point. I've worked with several young people who are in college, and you may be familiar if you're talking with those folks yourself. It's so different to engage in a class when you're isolated alone in your dorm room. And when you go to the dining hall and you can't sit with people to eat. It's very different than what we might have thought of as college experience when we're thinking of that. One other piece of social isolation, I'm smiling because it just makes me think a lot about it. Some families are really struggling because they're isolating together. So when we put that in terms of our young people, they are experiencing the stressors of their parent or caregiver or sibling or anything like that, and they're all stuck at home together. That balanced with people who are isolating alone, right? So we need to watch out for our young adults who live alone. We might be their connection to a human. And so we have to understand that that can have such a huge impact. Be that person for someone. Like I said, both pieces of isolation are hard, with other people and without other people. I do want you really thinking about that when it comes to the young people you're supporting. One last piece that I think we would be absolutely amiss if we didn't talk about would be a broad experience of grief and loss when it comes to the pandemic. I'm not going to ask you to share your own loss experience here today, but I do want you to think about that in terms of we're in a global situation where as of Sunday, there were 568,969 people who have died from a disease that we're working hard to be away from. When we think about that, that's constantly on our minds. And so we have this very broad experience of grief and loss that we may not name very often, right? And yeah, absolutely, we're unable to attend services in the way that we might normally do, right? We can't attend a wedding. We can't even have a wedding. We can't attend a funeral. We can't go to conferences live for work. We can't access our community. We can't travel or vacation, so we're losing our work-life balance. For young people, I want to think about adolescents specifically. I've talked with a lot of seniors this year, whether it was last March or this March, and they are grieving their senior year. This is not how I thought high school would end. This is not how I thought I would go to college. I'm not having a graduation. I'm not having a prom. I'm taking college tests in completely different ways than I've ever been expected to do. If I'm 15 or 16, what does it look like to get my first job right now? I might not have that possibility. We as adult people might say to them like, oh, we want you to have that job, but it feels really different right now. And so that is a lost experience for them. One other loss to think about is you're supporting people who might be pursuing higher education. I've heard this over the last 14 months. Athletes, people who depend on scholarships. What does that look like in a year where you're not playing your sports, right? We've lost, I'm seeing in our chat here, we've lost birthday parties for children. A first birthday is pretty significant. We've had people who are just experiencing this great deal of stress. And I want us to name together that that is all the impact of a pandemic that we did not have any control over. I feel like that's important just to say out loud. As we think about all those different impacts, obviously that can impact mental health. And so I want to give you some statistics on youth mental health as well as adult, just so you can understand how this is happening for people. If you've not had your own experiences with that, I'm going to ask you to pay special attention right now so that you can understand how that's impacting some of the young people you serve. So there's information that I want to provide to you from the CDC specifically, just looking to them as the government organization that is providing us the most statistics about mental health and pandemic-related changes that have happened for that. The chart that you're seeing in front of you right now is in reference to pediatric mental health visits to the emergency department. So what you're seeing is a study that was looked at from January to October of 2019 and 2020. And what this shows us is that there's been a significant increase in mental health visits to the emergency department for young people. This study specifically looks at ages 5 through 17. Kids age 5 to 11 have had an increase in mental health visits to the emergency department of 24% in this time period. For 12 to 17, that might be more along the lines of where we're supporting a little bit. That's 31% for them. I want to bring special attention to this point in the chart right here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. This is week 12, which would have been the end of March of 2020, when students often began engaging in remote learning. They lost their before and after school programming. Everybody kind of started working at home. In this 2-week period is when most states began to see their stay-at-home orders go into play. And then you'll notice a pretty significant and immediate increase in those mental health related emergency department visits per kid. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? I think we can say that's definitely an impact. One thing to note from this study, I'm not going to make you read it, but emergency department visits overall were down, which means even with fewer visits, there were more and more of them for mental health for young people. We're going to talk a little bit about adults. This will be anybody 18 and up. So this information also comes from the CDC. This was published in June of 2020. So this is only 3.5 months into the pandemic. And what this tells us is that even by that time, 3.5 months in, 40% of US adults were impacted with either mental health symptoms or increasing substance use or concerns for suicidality. The reason it's important for us to think about this is that it doesn't matter how long that went on, it's just that it's increasing. One thing that I do want to conceptualize with you, I've seen some folks, again, typing in the chat about their own experiences. The two things you see on the right-hand side of your screen, the increased or started substance use and the serious consideration of suicidality or suicide ideation. I think those two things can't be looked at independently. They are symptoms and related to the trauma-related disorders and anxiety and depression that you see on the other side of your screen. But that is still a significant increase for adults. All of this to say, yes, the pandemic has had impacts on our mental health for each of us, but also for the young people that we support, our colleagues, the people who live with the young people we support. And I want us to understand what the risk factors are and how we can understand also resiliency when it comes to mental health. Did a little bit of digging for some increased risk factors, mostly one of them. Risk factors don't mean that we're going to have a significant increase in concern for mental health specific to the pandemic. It just means that we're predisposed to potentially have those concerns. Think about the idea of we can have heredity for certain conditions, but without the right environmental conditions, we might be able to avoid that concern. For folks that have pre-existing mental health conditions, obviously the pandemic has been much more challenging for them, not only in terms of isolation, but also with access to services. So you may work with young people who had previously been seeing a therapist in person, being able to have regular visits with their psychiatrist or general physician for medication, maybe even attending support groups or things like AA or NA. And all of a sudden this year, all of those things have shifted, right? They're all virtual. And I think you can probably relate with me to say, like, if I need to do one more virtual thing, I don't know if I can take it. And so if we ask young people to engage in virtual supports, that's really tough for them. But folks with pre-existing mental health conditions can absolutely be struggling as an increased risk factor right now. Childhood temperament, I'm just going to talk about this one really quick. There was a longitudinal study that was done, kids that were surveyed at age 2 and 3, and then they were surveyed at age 18. So anywhere from 17 and 6 months to 18 and 6 months during the pandemic. And it was found that kids who had a certain temperament in childhood are more impacted with anxiety and depression during the pandemic. My mind was blown by that fact, because what that really means is we have this ingrained, intrinsic childhood temperament that's just part of who we are. It's a risk factor for us to experience anxiety and depression right now because of the environmental circumstances that we're in. Say that one more time. Something that we have no control over can impact our anxiety and depression during a pandemic right now. I want you to think about a young person who you've been supporting. And I just want to see how it changes your mind if you can think like, ooh, they have that childhood temperament. Like, would I reframe or rethink about how they're engaging right now? Right? If I can understand that it might just be part of their makeup that I need to support and find a way to support remotely or in person, it might not be something that feels completely in their control. The other thing that we have to talk about in our world is minority populations and communities. So talking specifically about communities of color and communities of lower socioeconomic status, there are hugely disparate access to healthcare, trust in government and systems to be able to provide support. A lot of folks in lower socioeconomic status areas have not had the opportunity to work remotely. They don't have the chance to work at home. They work in a front-facing, person-involved job. My hunch would be that you're very familiar with that and trying to support young people to continue that work or engage in that work while dealing with these community and society pressures that are happening for all of us. I want to switch and talk about resilience for a second. I'm not sure what the word resilience means to you, but what it means to me is having an internal strength to get through a situation that feels immensely difficult. And there's some factors that can increase our ability to be resilient. Some of that is being part of a supportive family or peer system, which again, we talked about with isolation can be really challenging right now. For young people specifically, it is shown that when they have a supportive other adult, meaning not a parent, not a grandparent, just another adult, that can be a teacher, that can be a job coach, that can be a therapist, that can be whoever it is, a young person who has that other supportive adult is more likely to develop resiliency in the face of adversity. Now, that doesn't mean we're asking the young person to just deal or just handle the situation, but it means that they're more likely to be resilient and have that strength when they need. Folks who have already established coping abilities, so especially for emotion regulation and distress tolerance, I think we can all agree that the last year has been pretty distressing at different times, whether that's personally or professionally. For folks who can regulate those emotions a bit better and tolerate distress at a higher level, that is a resilience factor when it comes to mental health in the pandemic, because we're being asked to be so flexible psychologically throughout everything that we do. I want to take a pause just for a second, and I'm going to invite, if there are any questions, you're welcome to pop them into the chat. I'm just reading a little bit about your experiences here. I'm trying to follow along with you, but want to just check and see if there's any quick questions about the mental health impacts of the pandemic before we move on to talk specifically about anxiety and trauma. Give you a second. Absolutely. So I'm being asked to repeat my definition of resilience. And so when I think of resilience, I'm going to try to remember exactly what I said before. But my definition of resilience is having the strength and being able to really kind of cope and process in the face of adversity. I think that's similar to what I said the first time. That's how I think about resilience, is strength and ability in the face of adversity. Some of that's also determination, right? So things can feel really hard and we can really struggle and still be resilient. Yeah. So I'm seeing a question about the ER visits because of mental health. Could it have been due to parents being more aware? Absolutely. They were together more often. One thing to note from that study is that overall emergency department visits were down. Part of that, I think, I don't remember specifically from the study, but there may be a kind of decrease in sort of accidental visits, right? We're not out doing things, we're not out and about. So there is that decrease, but it could be because parents are more aware and more in tune with what's going on for their children. Yeah, somebody shared that positive of having a Zoom meeting with family once a month. Absolutely, that's one way to fight that social isolation. What we are gonna move on, and I'm gonna talk specifically about anxiety. So we've talked a little bit about mental health in general for the pandemic, but I wanna teach you about the mechanisms of anxiety, what it looks like in young people and adults, specifically how it happens for us, how it works in your brain. I'm going to teach you a model that you can use to actually talk to young people about their experience so you can help them understand their world a little bit better. So when I say anxiety, obviously that diagnosis comes out of the big Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-5, by the American Psychiatric Association. That set of symptoms include cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, physiological symptoms, and behavioral symptoms. So we're going to work today to understand the first three so we can impact the last one. Okay? How I want you to think about it. We're understanding the first three so we can impact the behavior. So when we think about cognitive symptoms of anxiety, you'll see excessive worry. You'll see catastrophic thinking. What we hear from other people is we hear, but what if? Right? You probably work with lots of young people and they're like, oh, but what if this happens? That's an anxious thought. Or what if someone thinks this about me? Or what if this happens? Usually that's negative. We almost never predict things positively when it comes to anxiety. And sometimes that's really small thoughts that can turn into a really, really big worry. One other piece that I want you to think about when it comes to the cognitive aspect of anxiety. I'm going to share a thought with you, and then we're going to process it a little bit together. One thought is, what if I go to work and get sick and die? We may have heard that from young people who are supporting to try to work in our current climate. And as we hear that as adults, we hear that like there's a grain of truth to that. We also realize that that thought is a worry that is kind of much larger. We know that it's not likely to happen. Some of that could also be, I can't go to class, I can't go to school, I can't engage with you in program, whatever it is, or I'll get sick, or I'll bring something home to someone else that I live with that I care about, right? It's very natural to feel anxious about these things. A lot of those cognitions that we have are distorted. Now, it's very natural as humans to have distorted thought. It's especially difficult with pandemic-related anxiety because sometimes there's truth, but parts of those thoughts are irrational. Okay? I want to think about the emotional piece. I don't know about the rest of you, but I find myself having a range of emotions throughout the day, depending on what's going on right at work. I'm just noticing the chat, that fear of COVID or that fear of getting sick. And we're going to work on those skills today so that you can support them as best you can to get them engaged. So the emotional piece. When it comes to anxiety, we think about emotions like dread, panic, nervousness, overwhelm, fear. Oftentimes, you'll hear it described as like it comes out of nowhere, feels like it's with us all the time. There's a piece of this emotional aspect that I want you to understand, and that's something called depersonalization or derealization. Those are two terms that really speak to our experience in the world. So depersonalization is, I feel like I'm watching my world in third person. So I almost feel like I'm watching my life in a movie. When we become extremely overwhelmed for a great length of time, that can happen. So I feel like I'm outside my body watching myself. The other thing to think about is derealization. So I'm going through the world and thinking like, is this really happening? Is everything real around me? One really important thing to understand about pandemic-related anxiety is that everything around us is kind of different than what we've known before. And so it makes sense that we might feel like, okay, what's happening? When is this going to change? What's going to happen? So that's depersonalization and derealization that can be symptoms of anxiety, but don't have to be present for that. I want to think about the physiological symptoms, right? Has anybody felt an increased heartbeat, difficulty breathing, feeling your muscles get tense anytime you felt fearful or scared? Probably. Those physiological symptoms are the ones that we know about. So like, we don't have to be a mental health clinician to know like, oh, my body reacts when I feel scared or when I feel anxious. These are the ones that most often are happening after our cognitions and our emotions. So we need to understand that process. We first have thoughts and feelings, and then our body reacts. It feels the other way around, but I promise it's not. So your young people might report to you like, "Ooh, like, oh, I'm sick, my stomach hurts, I can't come in." Okay, are we nervous about it? Could be. Or, ooh, like I feel really lightheaded a lot when I'm like get ready to go to work. Yeah. Right? Maybe I feel like I'm going to burst into tears at any moment, or I feel like I'm really angry and I'm going to explode. These are all potential physiological symptoms of anxiety that's happening. And so everyone's having a heightened experience of that right now. So just keep that on your radar when you're working with people who are maybe presenting in front of you with like lack of engagement, not wanting to do things, and we'll sort of talk a little bit more about that later, how to reframe that on your side. Now we're getting to behavior. So the behavioral aspects of anxiety, again, we can be very familiar with this, but some folks experience things like repetitive or compulsive behavior in response to anxiety. It's not a requirement. A lot of people experience sleep disturbance. So they either have a really hard time falling asleep or they wake up in the night, right? They might not be having a bad dream, but they wake up anyway. I don't know about for you, but for me, when I have a terrible night's sleep, I am not pleasant to be around, and I don't want to go and engage with the world. So as we think about that, if someone's anxious and has sleep disturbance, they're going to struggle to engage with school, with work. We need to know that that's something happening for them. The biggest behavior that we're going to look at today is avoidance. I see some chatter in the chat over here about like people not wanting to come in or feeling anxious because they can't come in. I want you to reframe that not as we're refusing, but we are avoiding, right? And so if we can think about refusal as avoidance, avoidance has a function, it keeps us safe, whereas refusal feels more like I don't want to be there. Obstinate might be a good word for that. So avoidance is different than refusal. Not the behavior that we want to address today. Thinking about anxiety, I can promise you for certain that every person attending our session today has experienced anxiety at some level at some point in their life, right? Anxiety is a normal response. It's wired into us as humans. It happens for things like when we take a test, when we go to a job interview. when we do performance, if that's something we do, when we give presentations in person or by Zoom, right? It's natural to feel anxious. If you didn't do that, would you stay safe? How would you stay alert? How would you stay aware? Not all anxiety is pathologized. So not every person that you're working with who's experiencing anxiety because of the pandemic is going to qualify for some kind of mental health diagnosis. That doesn't mean that they're not struggling in some way, okay? But what it means is they might not meet full criteria for an anxiety disorder diagnosis. It's important to understand that even heightened levels of anxiety can still be difficult and challenging for people, even if it's not diagnosable or pathologized in that way. I'm going to say this one to you twice. Anxiety is something that happens. It's not who you are or who the young people are that you work with. Right? So anxiety is something that happens. It's not who you are. That is so important to remember because being anxious is not indicative of your capabilities or your strengths. You can be a very strong and very capable person and still be very anxious to the point where you can't do something, or where you feel inhibited to do something. So I want you to reframe for yourselves that someone has anxiety happening for them rather than it being who they are. When I work with young people, they'll come into my office and they'll say like, oh, I'm anxious. And I'll say, yes, you feel anxious, right? It's just the language that we use with them. It's not, I'm an anxious person. Like, I experience anxiety. Yeah, you do. And it gives that person some more ownership and almost power in their life when we can conceptualize mental health as something that happens for someone rather than who they are. One other thing to think about for anxiety is that it is a completely adaptive response, right? So if you didn't have anxiety, you wouldn't be alive and well. Our brains work very hard to keep us safe. And sometimes they might overreact just a little bit, or they're responding to something that's not a real threat. And that's anxiety. Anxiety is, I think something's a threat, but really it's not. When it comes to the pandemic, again, you've got to weigh that out. Sometimes it's rational, sometimes it's not. But I want you to know that anxiety is that natural, adaptive reaction. I see a question in the chat. Is anxiety a natural reaction or a fear? Anxiety as we experience it, cognitions, emotions, physiological symptoms, and behaviors is an adaptive, natural response. When I feel threatened, I experience anxiety or anxiousness. So you can almost use them interchangeably, fear and anxiety in that kind of situation. We're going to do an activity in just a little bit about that fear response, and I'm going to have you work together a little bit so we can conceptualize what those different responses can look like among our young people. So I appreciate that question. Okay, so we are going to learn a little bit about adolescent brain development. I don't know if you've learned this model before, so I want to encourage you. Again, anybody on video, you're welcome to participate with me. I want you all to participate at home, so just know that if you're not, I can feel it. So I'm going to teach you the brain-hand model, which is a way that we can conceptualize understanding brain development so that I want you to be able to share this with your young people so they can understand their experience, okay? So I'm gonna ask you to hold your hand up. I'm gonna shift around a little bit. So hold your hand up in front of your face. I'm gonna ask you to go ahead and face your palm toward you. I'm gonna do mine the other way so you can see. But so, okay, ready? This is your central nervous system. Say hello. Okay. So when we're looking at our brains, we have right here between our wrist and the bottom of our thumb, this portion of our hand is our primitive brain. Okay, so primitive brain, meaning basic functions, involuntary actions. So this is our heartbeat and our hormone secretion and our breathing and all the stuff that keeps our body alive. Okay. Now we're going to take that thumb. We're going to keep these fingers pushed together up here. Okay. Thank you for the people on camera. I'm being able to monitor you. I appreciate that. Now we're going to take that thumb and we're going to tuck it right here in the middle. Okay. And this is going to be our limbic system. So our limbic system in our brain is comprised of our amygdala and our hypothalamus and our hippocampus, which are all just really big words to say this is where our brain stores emotion. This is where we experience trauma if it's happened to us. This is where lots of our memories are made, but it's mostly the emotional center of our brain. So I'm going to ask you to take these 4 fingers and just fold them over that thumb as tight as you can. And then if you're looking at your hand, you see your brain, right? There's your brain in front of you. So this outer part, including your fingers, is your cerebral cortex. So what this is the part of your brain that helps you with thinking and imagination and problem solving and time management and emotion regulation and all of those different pieces. Okay, so quick review. Ready? Primitive brain, body functions. Emotional center of our brain, limbic system, is the emotional center of our brain, all of our emotions. And our cerebral cortex is how we problem solve and think, higher levels of thinking. When we think about this brain model from a psychologist, Dan Siegel, with adolescent development, this is in general, could be anger, anxiety, any of that, but specifically pandemic anxiety for young people. I want you to take those 4 fingers and I just want you to like make them real loose right here, right? Okay, so this would be like if my emotional center of my brain was working and then it was like able to like shoot things through my finger, like it's winning, right? The emotional center is winning. Because when we're young, until we're 25, we don't have this piece fully developed. I'll say that one more time. We don't have a full prefrontal cortex or cerebral cortex until we're 25 years of age, which means when something happens to me and my emotions are triggered and I'm less than 25, I flip my lid and my emotional brain takes over, right? I want everybody to practice. Flip your lid. Name a tough emotion and flip your lid. Anger. I'm anxious. I'm really upset. They're making me go to work, right? So this is when young people respond to you and they're very emotional. It's not their fault. We want them to learn, but it is their brain. And like, whoop, like that emotion is bigger than I can handle. That makes sense? That is flipping your lid. I want you to be able to teach that to your young people. I think I saw folks following along. You've got a diagram here in the slides because it's important for young people to understand like, oh, I have emotions. I'm not giving you a free pass on not figuring out ways to manage them or cope with them, but I'm teaching you that your brain is responding in a very natural way, right? So I see a question here. How can we all control our emotions? Well, what we hope is that as we age past 25, that we develop that prefrontal cortex. So I say prefrontal, that part right here in the front. And that is where we do our higher level reasoning for emotion regulation. It's how we can have fluctuations in mood that don't become a crisis. Ways that we do that are developing a lot of insight through introspection. So learning about our own thoughts and feelings, learning about our own responses to the world, going to therapy, figuring out how to manage those emotions if they're feeling challenging for you. Some of the skills we're going to work on today are going to be for you to support young people, working with them when they experience emotion with you. But I'm hopeful that that can also be helpful to some of you as well, to bring into your own lives, not just at work. Okay, we're going to do a quick review and then we're going into breakout rooms. So again, anxiety happens because we experience a stimulus or stressor. Our limbic system is activated, our emotional brain takes over, and then we experience those cognitive, emotional, behavioral, physiological responses. We flip our lid, right? One important piece when it comes to the pandemic is that the stimulus or stressor can be internal or external. So an external stressor right now is I go to work and I'm exposed to potential COVID-19. That's an external stressor. Right? So I'm gonna have some kind of response to that. An internal stressor, I think I have a cognition that is telling me I'm unsafe in some way. Let's make it not related to the pandemic, because that's a tough one. It can be thoughts or stressors, like external stressors. See a question here. Do we help young people understand emotional intelligence to help them work through emotions? Absolutely. So a piece of that is learning to name your emotions, right? So in my line of work, we have a saying that's name it to tame it. So if you can name all of your emotions, you can better understand your experience. So if I'm really angry, but I don't know that I'm angry, that's unhelpful to me. Does that help answer your question a little bit, Miley? So we're back to this idea of a natural adaptive response. So we're talking about our fight, flight, or freeze response. Oftentimes when you're working with young people, when I'm working with young people, we're seeing them because they're having a fight, flight, or freeze response. We're trying to figure out what's going on. We're trying to get them engaged around that response. And we have to understand that that response, fight, flight, or freeze, is completely evolutionary. And again, a very adaptive response. I'm going to show you a picture real quick. Right? So the idea is we've developed through evolution to do what it takes for us to be alive. That's how our brains work. And so I don't know about you, but I'm gonna probably flee in this situation. Just my natural instinct, maybe. So going back just a second. Our fight response we might see as aggression. Now I'm gonna use that word very loosely. Aggression doesn't mean fighting. Aggression can mean yelling. Aggression can mean pushing away. Aggression can mean the combo response. I don't want to do that. You can't make me do that. And then I leave. That's a fight response. Flight response is I'm avoiding my stressor. I'm avoiding my threat. This might be the one that you're experiencing the most with your young people. If I feel threatened by work, I don't want to go there, right? I'm avoiding. And we're conceptualizing that as an adaptive response. We're gonna try to find ways to help them with it, but we understand where it comes from, right? And then, excuse me, our freeze response is literally that. When we experience something that's so threatening, we are paralyzed. We don't know what to do. We are frozen. We experience a state of shock. That also comes from our limbic system, right? Oftentimes when people experience trauma, which we'll talk briefly about trauma in a little while, that's what happens, right? I'm in a traumatic experience and I don't do anything. It's not that I don't choose to do it, it's that I can't. I'm frozen. So we have our fight, flight, or freeze response. Do that, you'll remember. So what we are going to do now is we are going to split off into some breakout rooms.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through this portion of the recording. Here in 1 second.
Francisco, I don't fully understand your question. If you could rephrase it, that would be helpful. Yes, Kristen, the freeze response often is paired with the dissociation that's part of a trauma response. So oftentimes in trauma, our bodies freeze and we actually do not recall or are not connected in those moments. So yes, that dissociation can be a part of that freeze response.
Okay. Bear with me here, audience.
Guided meditation just to bring us back to this space. We're gonna power through the end here. I'll check in with you in just a moment. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I'm gonna invite you again just to bring your attention either to the image on the screen, or you can pick a static spot near you, either your desk or the wall. And we're going to do a quick guided meditation through a mental vacation, just to give us a little bit of a grounding for this afternoon, or for the rest of this afternoon. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable, and take a slow, smooth breath in through your nose, and exhale softly through your mouth. Take another slow, smooth breath in through your nose, and out through your mouth. Continue this pattern of slow breathing for the rest of this visualization. Now imagine yourself in a peaceful place, a place where you feel calm and safe. Maybe it's a special place that you've been to before, or maybe it's somewhere you would like to go. Perhaps somewhere like a beautiful beach, beside a gentle forest stream, or sitting by a warm, crackling fire. Picture yourself in this place. Imagine what you are experiencing through all of your senses. Look around you. Notice what you see. Notice what you hear. Notice what you smell. Notice what you feel under your feet, on your skin. Allow yourself to relax in this place. You are completely at peace here. Continue to picture yourself in this place while focusing on your breathing. Taking a slow, smooth breath in through your nose and exhaling slowly through your mouth. Now continue to take slow, long breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. It may take time to learn how to let go of tension and relax your body, but you can come back to this place as often as you like. If you notice any tension in your body, notice it. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes or bring your attention back to a room. A little more grounded for the rest of our talk together today. So I want to talk very briefly. We've mentioned it in the chat and in some of our discussion today, but I want to talk a little bit about trauma. So we've talked primarily about anxiety and the experiences that we have in our bodies, but I want you to understand how we can conceptualize the pandemic as a collective trauma and what trauma really means. So the definition of an actual trauma, and then different ways that we can see that. So again, back to that Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. The definition of trauma in the DSM is to have exposure to threat of or actual death. So that means having your own life threatened by direct threat, or experiencing a threat or actual death of someone else, a family member or close friend, knowledge of something happening to that person. And when we think about that definition of trauma in the context of a pandemic, we can see how many people have experienced collective trauma when it comes to threat of life. Again, as we talked about anxiety, not all trauma experience will necessarily be pathologized or labeled as such, but there are those specific trauma disorders that do occur for people who've experienced a trauma. So that can be post-traumatic stress disorder, which we know as PTSD. That could be acute stress disorders. And that could also mean something called an adjustment disorder. If you're not familiar with those, an adjustment disorder really means I've experienced a stressor and I'm having a response that's slightly more elevated than what we would anticipate a normal response to be. And that lasts for only a specific amount of time. So once that stressor is over, then my adjustment disorder has resolved. So it's not an ongoing long-term mental health condition, but it is a traumatic response. I bring that up today because I think that's something I'm seeing in many of the young people I support. They are showing this symptom presentation in response to the pandemic onset and being able to have that resolve as we see things return back to normal a little bit. Yes, was looking at time now that hopefully everyone's back. We are going to work as quickly as we can to make sure we're done close to 3 o'clock. We may be here a little bit after, and I understand that we may not have interpretation after 3 p.m. We're trying to clarify that right now. So I will work as quickly as possible and try to support whatever needs come up about that. Kim, thank you for letting me know that you'll need to leave. So looking at the pandemic as collective trauma, we know that every person we interact with, so think about the young people you support, every single person that they interact with is also impacted by the thing that is causing them stress right now. And so to think about the reach of that impact in all of our social circles, whether it's work or family, every person that we know is impacted in some way, globally. Right, and we just think about the collective nature of that and how big that really is. When it comes to that, we are trying to manage our own responses as we try to support others. So that's one thing I want you to take from our talk today, is that you're allowed to have your own response. You're allowed to have your own needs. And also, I need you to meet those needs before you can support our young people with the things that they're struggling with, or finding ways to engage them. I'm going to show you one thing at the end that you can modify for the young people, but it's really more for you to take care of yourselves as we go. The reason I brought up adjustment disorder earlier is because it's all about what's more than what we would consider a normative response. So I'm just going to put a question out there that I don't have an answer to, and that question is, what is considered a normative response to a global pandemic? Right? We don't know what that normal response would look like. So I think we have to be really careful not to pathologize people as they're experiencing pandemic stressors right now. I was just informed that we will have interpretation a few minutes after 3 for folks that need that. So we'll continue to work on it. Okay, so what I want to teach you now is just really common trauma responses. Some of these words will look familiar. I'll remind you, our anxiety section was about cognitive responses, emotional responses, physiological responses, and behavioral responses. But when it comes to trauma experience, we also have physical, cognitive, emotional, and social responses. So we can see the similarities of that. Complex PTSD absolutely is so impactful, can include all of these things and many more issues. Complex trauma goes into any number of things. I didn't include information here about adverse childhood experiences, but we know that folks who have had prolonged or complex exposure to trauma, they really need support and mental health care, but also need understanding from the people around them. So thank you for bringing that up, Megan. So some of the things we might experience: physical responses to trauma, inability to form words, the same physiological sensations we talked about earlier in different situations. Cognitive symptoms of trauma could be memory loss, or again, that sort of dissociation of not really being connected to our world in that way. Could impact sleep, difficulty with concentration, confusion. Emotionally, some folks can be very reactive. Some folks can experience hypoarousal and have very numb emotions. You can see irritability, you can see disconnection, you can see anger, you can see sadness. There's any number of things that can happen when someone has experienced a trauma. And then the social aspect of trauma, also we see that withdrawal or avoidance. We might see hypersensitivity, both to environment, but also to potentially interactions with other people. Withdrawal from kind of preferred activities, things that feel have traditionally felt good for that person. One key difference between the anxiety we talked about earlier and trauma as a whole is the kind of arousal and reactivity. So people are hyper aroused. They're constantly seeking that, feeling unsafe and needing to feel like they're in a safer place. And just being able to conceptualize anxiety and trauma with the young people that we work with, to understand that our reactions are normal right now. I did a little breakdown for you here, just of some similarities and differences. What I want you to take away from our talk today is that we might not be able to necessarily name everything anxiety or everything trauma, but what we know is that the pieces in the middle of this Venn diagram, negative thoughts, those physiological responses, the avoidance that we experience, feeling angry or upset, and having difficulty engaging with our lives, those are across the board for anxiety and trauma. So we need to know that that's a situation or situations that are occurring for the young people that we're helping, which is why we're trying to reframe what we're doing with them. Okay. I want you to repeat after me. I realize you might not have your camera on or you might not have your microphone on, and that's okay. But I want you to say this out loud. The people that I support, or the young people that I support, are not resisting, they're hurting. Go ahead, you can say it. The young people I work with are not resisting, they're hurting. The young people I work with are not refusing, they're trying to heal. That is so important for you to think about, because we can't support young people if we think they're doing something wrong, right? We have to understand that they're trying to engage in a world that feels so challenging right now. And we as adults we can process that. We have the cognitive ability to do that. But people, younger folks, don't always have that capability yet. They're still learning. One question that I think you can ask when you're working with participants, whoever they are, whether they're vocational participants, educational participants, for me, therapy participants, rather than asking them the question, why aren't you engaging? I want you to ask them the question, what's happening right now that's keeping you from being able to engage? Okay, let's say it again. Instead of asking, why aren't you engaging? I want you to ask them, what's happening for you right now that's keeping you from being able to engage? Right? We're working really hard today to make sure that we're conceptualizing our response to a pandemic as something that we experience rather than a choice that we're making. Okay? I think if I had to pick one thing out of our whole talk today, that's the thing I want you to take out of it. So make sure you write that down. Okay, we are going to skip this bout of question asking. If you have questions, I'm happy to try to respond to them in the chat or respond them out loud. And we're going to move on to skill building. Okay, so we are looking at very specific skills that I want to help you with today. We're going to move quickly through validation. We'll just do a quick practice. I'm going to have you verbalize out loud. I was asked to repeat. I'm not sure what I was asked to repeat. We are going to work on
the thing you said to be important for us to remember.
The thing I said to be important is, rather than asking a young person, why aren't you engaging? I want you to ask them, what's happening for you right now that's keeping you from being able to engage? I hope that helps you, Kat. So what we're going to do now is we're going to work a little bit on validation, some supportive approaches to problem solving with young people, and then we're going to work a little bit on self-care. We are running short on time, but I am still going to show you this video if I can get it to work, because I think it illustrates exactly what I want you to pay attention to. This is a how do I not help someone? Okay, so please keep that in mind as you're going. We're going to watch this just for a couple of minutes.
Tell me about the problem that you wish to address.
Oh, okay. Well, I have this fear of being buried alive in a box. I just start thinking about being buried alive and I begin to panic.
Has anyone ever tried to bury you alive in a box?
No, but truly thinking about it does make my life horrible. I mean, I can't go through tunnels or be in an elevator or in a house, anything boxes.
No, what you're saying is you're claustrophobic.
Yes, that's it.
All right, well, let's go, Kevin. I'm going to say 2 words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully. Then I want you to take them out of the office with you and incorporate them into your life.
Well, so I write them down.
Well, if it makes you comfortable, it's just 2 words. You find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
You're there. Yes. STOP, new word, 19.
All right, so that is our reminder of how not to support someone. You could hear in her expression, she might be expressing some fears that seem irrational to him. She's talking about how that's impacting her life. She can't go into a house, she can't go into a store, whatever. One way to not help someone who's experiencing anxiety or mental health concerns is to tell them to stop it, STOP, new word IT, or to tell them to calm down or get over it, right? So that's not what we're gonna focus on. The first step that I wanna work with you today is how do we provide validation? I think we throw that word around a lot, but I really want you to think about what does it mean to validate a person. I'm going to give you 3 steps for validation so that you have a structure in your mind of what do I need to provide to this participant so that they can have feel that they're heard and so that they can understand that their emotional experience can be normalized. Right? So the idea of validation is I'm just trying to normalize someone's experience and help them feel heard. I'm not trying to problem solve anything yet. One thing that validation is not is arguing with irrational thoughts or beliefs. We understand that the young people we work with or the people we support for accessing the community or education, they may have thoughts right now that are not completely rational when it comes to engaging. There are certain fears that are coming up. I'm not asking you to argue with those beliefs at all. All we're going to do is come up with a structure that you can use to say, I hear you and I hear how you feel and I'm here with you. That's all we have to do with validation, right? Part of this, you've worked today, we've done a couple of guided meditations. I've asked you to share about your own impact of COVID on your life. You need to understand your own emotional response as you work to validate someone. Right? So if you're having a tough day, if you're feeling angry or anxious yourself, it's really hard to provide validation for someone. So just be attuned to that. So our structure for validation looks like this. We want to connect, we want to name, and we want to normalize. So what that looks like is I want to connect. I'm talking with a young person and they're sharing their experience with me or their concern. And I might say like, wow, it sounds like you feel, I'm going to name an emotion that I hear from them. They might look really angry, or they might look really hesitant or resistant. And I'm going to try to name that feeling underneath, right? Wow, I can imagine how scary it would feel to think you're going to get sick at work. I bet a lot of people are feeling that way right now. Right? That's an example of how you can connect, name the emotion, and normalize. When it comes to normalizing, being a therapist with young people, we think a lot about self-disclosure, right? So what does it mean if I share a piece of myself with that young person? You can disclose to your participants, you can tell them a little bit about your experience without saying it's yours, right? So one way to normalize this is to say, I bet there's lots of people that feel that way right now. Right? You could be one of those people. You don't have to say like, I felt the same way if that doesn't feel comfortable to you. Validation is all about helping that person feel heard, right? So participant is saying, I can't get over the fact that I have to go to work wearing a mask. Like, I just don't feel safe there, right? It sounds like you feel really worried about what's going to happen. I bet there's lots of other people that work with you that might feel the same way. It's very simple statements. They're not overly complicated, but just to be able to connect with that person, to name how they're feeling or potentially feeling, and then to normalize that is a huge relief for them to feel heard and to know that somebody who's supporting them understands their experience, right? I was going to ask if there's anybody who's willing to participate in a role play, but we're going to skip that. So you're off the hook for doing a role play right now with validation. We are going to do a short breakout room about the next strategy. So this is supportive problem solving and in therapy. So if I'm working with someone who's experiencing anxiety.
Okay, so the rest of the session is just the breakout room. So we're going to skip that portion because it's not content heavy. And we are going to close this out. So Sarah or Tara, would you like to close out this session just with any final remarks? And then just for closing out for housekeeping purposes, I wanted to reiterate that this WIOA Wednesday webinar was recorded, even though we just watched the recording. And then the discussion will be recorded for the 1 o'clock session as well. There also will be a follow-up survey that you will be receiving that coincides with both of the sessions from today. And if you could please provide us with any feedback or comments, we would love to hear from you. And then Tara, did we want to have, if there's any questions or anything, please feel free to put those in the chat. But I think the majority of our discussion will be held at the 1 o'clock session. Is that correct?
Correct. So hopefully you can join us for that 1 o'clock session. We'll use the questions that we provided both in the chat and then on the website as kind of our guide, but we're open to other discussion about this as well. So thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you at the 1 o'clock discussion, unless we have anything else. I don't see anything in the chat.
No, I don't see anything either. So again, if you want, we did put the link to register for the 1 o'clock session if you weren't able to do that in the chat. Or if you aren't able to join us at 1 o'clock, we will record it. So if you just want to hear the discussion and listen to it at a later date, you'll have that capability as well. And I don't see any questions. So we will hopefully see the rest of you at 1 o'clock and we can discuss. That will be a Zoom meeting. So you will be able to unmute and turn your cameras on, and it will be more of a discussion format. So we will see you then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.